Chapter 24, The Pieces. Old Fred had been found dead on the train in the early hours of the morning, having suffered a massive heart attack. He was wearing boots that matched the prints around the base of the Castiglione's treehouse. Although Fred's beard was gone and his glasses were different, Calder had recognized his voice. Fred had knocked him off the slide, and Calder had hit his head in the fall. He then pretended to be unconscious. When it looked like Fred was gone, Calder got to his feet. His head was pounding, he was dizzy, and there was no sign of Petra. He hoped with all his heart that she had gotten help before Fred caught up with her. Calder started for home, moving unsteadily through backyards. He was just resting in the bushes when Fred ran by carrying the lady. Calder followed. Hiding behind bushes, he watched Fred climb up to the Castiglione's treehouse with the painting. When he heard the loud crack of a tree branch and saw Fred scramble up onto the tracks, he felt there was no time to go get official help. He had to get the lady down. Fred might be sending someone back within minutes to retrieve her. Calder staggered across the Castiglione's backyard, tried to step carefully in Fred's footprints so as not to leave a trail, and climbed the tree. When he reached the platform and saw that the painting was safe, he stopped to rest. That was when he passed out. Shortly after, Petra found him, possibly saving his life. He had a nasty concussion, but recovered enough to have birthday cake the next day with his friend. Petra reminded him that they were now even. He had probably saved her life by distracting old Fred while she ran with the painting. Fred Stedman's name, it turned out, was Xavier Glitz. He was the leader of an international crime ring. The FBI discovered that Glitz had advanced degrees from the Sorbonne in Paris and from Princeton University. His nickname in the world of art theft was Glitterman. He was famous for changing identities and for charming his way in and out of impossible situations. In addition to his New York home, he had an apartment in London and one in Rome. All of his files on the theft of a lady writing turned up in a bank vault in Switzerland. Xavier Glitz had a customer who wanted for many years to own this particular Vermeer masterpiece. The collector, a clever criminal himself, would pay Glitz $60 million for her, but wanted a guarantee that the police would never trace the theft. Glitterman had come up with what he thought was a brilliant plan. He would pose as an idealistic thief. He picked Hyde Park as the perfect community in which to hide, and the role of Zelda Zagovia's husband as a perfect disguise. Shortly after he and Zelda were married, they attended a fundraising dinner at the university school. There, he chatted with a young teacher named Isabel Husey, who had just been hired to teach at the school in the fall. Discovering that she had been trained as an art historian, he drew her into a discussion about Vermeer, pretending to be ignorant himself about the painter's work. Miss Husey gave him all the ideas about attribution that went into the thief's letters. At the University of Chicago's archives, Xavier Glitz gained the trust of one of the research librarians, who told him about a secret compartment in Delia Dell Hall, a compartment that was supposedly under the main staircase. Glitz had explained to the librarian that he was documenting secret storage places in the greatest universities in the world, and claimed that he had heard of several at Oxford, at Harvard, at McGill, and at the University of Salamanca. The librarian at the University of Chicago was happy to tell him all she knew. While living on Harper Avenue, Glitz heard about his reclusive neighbor, Louise Sharp, and soon found out she was Leland Sharp's widow. She, like Miss Husey, had passionate feelings about Vermeer's work. It was almost too good to be true. And then Glitz met Vincent Watch at Powell's. They chatted, and Mr. Watch mentioned that his two great loves were art books and mysteries, and that he hoped one day to write an art mystery that focused on real issues in the art world. He had never gotten around to writing such a book, but had dreamed about it for years. Glitz had nodded sympathetically. According to a journal found by the FBI in Glitz's bank vault, he came up with the idea of the three letters in order to confuse the authorities and to create three suspects. Then he had fun writing the letters that were published by newspapers and watching the public's reaction. His theft had become a one-of-a-kind world event, and he was a hero to thousands of people. He was only sorry that no one would ever know he was responsible. After writing the letter in which he threatened to burn the painting, and in which he said he was old and would not live long, hoping obviously to sound like Mrs. Sharp, Glitz had planned to remove a lady writing from the secret compartment, deliver it for his $60 million, and allow the world to believe it had been burned. He was quite sure that no museum would meet the demands in his last letter. The FBI speculated that on the night he returned to Dell Hall to get the painting, he had just parked his car when he heard the building alarm go off, and then saw Calder and Petra running. That was where things started to go wrong. In their investigations, the FBI found that Mrs. Sharp had a great deal of money and that she had made a very generous gift to the National Gallery after the theft had taken place. She explained in a steely tone that she had wanted to remain anonymous, disliking publicity after the circumstances of her husband's death. She had intended the money to pay for gatherings of Vermeer scholars to work on attribution and on the crime. When the money was used to pay for the Vermeer dilemma, she was surprised but could hardly complain given her request. Miss Husey was horrified when she heard from Mrs. Sharp about everything Calder and Petra had done to protect her. Never having lived in a big city, she had been lonely and homesick that fall. She had received a strange letter. When the painting was stolen and she realized that her ideas about Vermeer's work sounded like the thief's, she had been frightened. Trying to figure out what to do with the thief's letter had been the final straw. She had no one to talk to in Chicago, no one, that is, but her 6th grade class. Zelda Segovia was horrified that she'd been charmed into marrying a professional criminal. She knew nothing about Xavier Glitz or his shady business. When Tommy found out that his stepfather's real nickname was Glitterman, he snorted, "More like Twitterman. I never heard of so much gabbing in my life. The way he promised stuff and then figured out how to take it away? What a sneak." Frank Ondely felt terrible about having frightened Petra that day in Dell Hall. He had been delivering an old print from one of the science labs to the guy with the big eyebrows, who was a publicity man working for the university. Petra's dad changed departments that winter and was much happier with his new job. Vincent Watch had carried the letter around with him for weeks, getting a secret thrill from knowing it was in his pocket. He didn't want to contact the police before he was sure the thief wasn't going to contact him with an interesting proposal that he could then use in a book. The letter would be a good way to begin an art mystery. When the news came out about Mrs. Sharp and Miss Husey being the other 2 recipients, he decided to confide in Mrs. Sharp. He knew she wouldn't talk and would give him sound advice about whether to call the police. After Calder's last delivery to Mrs. Sharp, Mr. Watch stopped by her house on the way home from work. When he reached into his pocket to show Mrs. Sharp the letter, it was gone. He never understood how this had happened. He must have missed his pocket the last time he slid the letter back in, and it must have fallen out on his walk down Harper Avenue. He was extremely upset, but Mrs. Sharp was sympathetic and practical. They agreed that it no longer made sense for him to tell the authorities about the 3rd letter. Since he had no proof of having gotten it, he'd just look silly. This, strangely, was the 2nd time he'd lost the letter. He'd made a copy weeks earlier in case he lost the original, and it had somehow gotten away from him between the copy store and Powell's. It was almost eerie. This was the letter Petra saw blowing around, but as Mr. Watch hadn't told Mrs. Sharp about it, Petra never knew where it came from. She told Mrs. Sharp about finding the 3rd letter tucked neatly into the bushes. They agreed it was a chain of events that would have intrigued Charles Fort. As soon as the FBI had finished their questioning, Mrs. Sharp, Calder, and Petra got together again for tea in Mrs. Sharp's kitchen. This time, the tulips were yellow. Mrs. Sharp congratulated the children on their extraordinary bravery and intelligence. Coming from her, this was quite a compliment. After tea, Calder filled in Mrs. Sharp on all the patterns of 12 he had identified. He told her about his pentomino seeming to give him messages. He explained that he was quite sure there were more 12s involved. Mrs. Sharp's eyes became slits, as they had in the hospital when Petra had talked about her dream. The old woman was very quiet. They told her about the monkey, panel, vines, flute, fines moment on the stairs of Delia Dell. They asked her if she had done that on purpose. "I wish," she said, giving them a smile that was almost wistful. She thanked them both for sharing such fabulous secrets and promised she would never tell those secrets to another soul, not without their permission. Somehow, Calder and Petra knew they could trust her. Then she offered a secret of her own and asked them to keep it until after her death. Both agreed immediately, and Petra reached out to pat Mrs. Sharp's bony hand. Mrs. Sharp went over some of what Calder and Petra had already heard about her past. She said that just before her husband, Leland, had been murdered, she had received a letter from him saying he had made a stunning discovery about Vermeer's paintings, a discovery that would shake art historians all over the world. He couldn't wait to tell her about it, but wanted to save the news until he was safe and sound in Hyde Park. And then, on the day he was due to fly back to Chicago, his body was found outside the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. He had been killed by a blow to the head. His date book had been in his suitcase, which was in the hotel lobby. When Mrs. Sharp looked in the date book weeks later, she saw 12/12 scribbled hurriedly in his handwriting on the day of his death. She pointed this out to the police, but no one knew what to make of it. Did it mean 12 minutes past noon or past midnight? Did it represent the number 1212? She wasn't able to figure it out either. The police never brought anyone to trial, and the mystery had faded over time. After telling the children the story, Mrs. Sharp sat quietly for a moment looking down at the table. Then she blinked rapidly, sat up straight, and blew her nose. She continued in her familiar businesslike tone. "I became determined to pick up where Leland had left off, but I never could figure out exactly what it was he had uncovered or realized. In the years since, I've studied everything I could about Vermeer. I vowed that I would support any new research on his life or his paintings. And then, last fall, something very odd began to happen to me, and this is the part I want you to keep a secret." Mrs. Sharp said she had been told by the woman in A Lady Writing to clear the name of Vermeer, to make sure that the world knew that a number of his works had been done by followers. She had received pages and pages of messages, words she said she had merely written down. Calder and Petra looked at each other as Mrs. Sharp disappeared to get a sheet of paper from the pile next to her computer. She settled back down at the kitchen table. This is what she read. "My lie is that I am only canvas and pigment. My truth is that I am alive. Some might call this your imagination, but it's not. Art, as you know, is about ideas. I am as real as your blue china, or the boy with the box, or the girl who dreamed about me. I am very much here." Seeing how sober the children's faces had become, Mrs. Sharp stopped to reassure them. "I am sharing this with you just to show you what I am beginning to see. Something much more powerful than any one of us has pulled us all together. Although Xavier Glitz thought he was in control, he was just a piece of the picture, if you'll pardon the pun. Something managed to communicate with each of us, including the thief, each in a way that we were willing to hear or see." With a flicker of a smile, Mrs. Sharp reached across the wooden table to straighten a tulip. Catching the afternoon sun, the petals filled with color, a clean cup of lemon in the winter light. Suddenly Petra remembered picking up a leaf on Harper Avenue that fall and being struck by the thought that yellow was the color of surprise. Calder did discover more 12s. First, he made a list. Petra Andely, Frank Andely, Norma Andely, Calder Pillay, Walter Pillay, Yvette Pillay, Isabel Husey, Louise Sharp, Tommy Segovia, Zelda Segovia, Vincent Watch, Xavier Glitz, also known as Fred Stedman. There were 12 names and 12 letters in each name. Mrs. Sharp got all pink-cheeked and pleased when Calder showed her the list, and after thinking for a moment, she said slowly, "Yes, how curious. The message 1212 also has 12 letters if you spell it out, and so does the name of the painting, A Lady Writing, at least in English." She reminded Calder and Petra that Charles Fort didn't believe in coincidence. He felt things were often connected in ways that no one could yet explain in scientific terms. But if none of this was coincidence, what was it? Calder and Petra were more than a little spooked by it all. They were very glad that they had Mrs. Sharp to talk to. They thought it was pretty extraordinary that she had, in the hospital, said just about the same thing as Picasso about art, lies, and the truth. Maybe the greatest ideas were quite simple, or maybe certain experiences in life are made to fit together like pentominoes. Maybe the passage of time, even centuries, didn't matter when something really important needed to be said. If there were more 12 names involved, and if each name was a piece in a very big puzzle, did any of those 12 fit together in other ways? Over many cups of tea, Calder, Petra, and Mrs. Sharp found a number of odd connections. The most startling one was that the first letter of the first name of each person on Calder's list was a pentomino. The U is my C, Calder explained. It's just a matter of a simple turn, not even a flip. I never liked the U being a U anyway. Calder then realized that if you thought about those 12 people as pentominoes, you could see that certain ones fit into rectangles more easily than others. The X, Xavier, for instance, is the hardest pentomino to work with. The U, or C, for Calder, and the P for Petra, however, work easily into many solutions. The L, Louise, can fit easily with the I, Isabel, and the W, Walter, with the Y, Yvette, or the F, Frank, with the N, Norma. Calder's thoughts were running wild. Then he and Petra remembered Miss Husey saying, "The letter is dead," at the beginning of the school year. Well, one letter certainly was, they thought grimly, the X. Although Leland Sharp was not on the list, Calder noticed that the first letter of his first name began with the 12th letter in the alphabet. Petra added that L was a very useful pentomino and worked easily into most rectangles. Yes, he always did manage to fit into every new situation. Mrs. Sharp sniffed and looked pleased. He loved puzzles and codes, you know. He would have appreciated pentominoes. Isabel Husey and Louise Sharp both turned out to be descendants of a member of the Coffin family on Nantucket Island. Both had lived there. Mrs. Sharp had written this letter she told Calder and Petra about. After the mystery was solved, Miss Husey and Mrs. Sharp were often seen having dinner together in Hyde Park. They had lots to talk about and enjoyed each other's thinking. As the school year went on, Miss Husey became as much a friend as a teacher to Petra and Calder. The three often went to Fargo Hall after school for hot chocolate. Petra did show Miss Husey her copy of Lowe. The 6th grade class tried to add to Charles Fort's accounts and studied the idea of coincidence. Was it, as a number of interested scientists believed, just the human fascination with patterns, or was it something more? Frank and Norma Ondely and Walter and Yvette Pillay all turned out to be 43 years old. They had all been 12 in the year of Leland Sharp's death, which had been 31 years earlier. Mrs. Sharp and the children wondered if there was any connection with the 1931 publication date of Lowe. They also realized with a shudder that Vermeer had been 43 when he died. Petra's dad told Petra about something else stunning. A part of his family had lived for centuries in the Netherlands, in an area not far from Delft. Family records were sketchy, but it was entirely possible that Petra was related to a member of Vermeer's family. Petra walked on air for days. Calder in his research found that Johannes Vermeer had collapsed quite suddenly in December 1675. He had been buried in the Oudkerk in Delft on December 16th. It was thought that he died several days earlier, which would have made December 12th perhaps the last full day of his life. In addition to being Petra's and Calder's birthday, it had also been the last conscious day of Xavier Glitz's life. And then there was Frog. Once Petra remembered Fort's sentence, "We shall pick up an existence by its frogs." She pointed out to Calder that perhaps it had been some kind of strange clue. Maybe they should have picked up Glitterman's existence from Frog. Within weeks of the lady's return to the National Gallery, the wall labels on a number of Vermeer paintings around the world were quietly changed to attributed to Johannes Vermeer. In celebration, Calder and Petra went to the Drake Hotel with Mrs. Sharp for tea, and she told them both about deliveries that were soon to be made at each of their houses. She gave Calder an antique globe and a real oriental carpet that looked just like the geographer's. She gave her writing desk, an elegant 17th century beauty, to Petra. She also gave her a string of real Dutch pearls. Calder and Petra, in their interviews with the press, didn't share the entire story. They never mentioned Petra's dream, Calder's problem-solving, Charles Fort, the 12s, or the blue ones. They didn't know if the world was ready for it, and they still weren't entirely sure what had been real and what had not. There's one last picture. Petra, Calder, and the lady. The end.